Okay, welcome back. This is Chapter 7, the Lucky 7. So, this chapter is all about what's called support services. Now, that doesn't mean like they're optional or anything. These services are pretty much well required in order to get anything done on the internet. Let's look at the learning objectives. So, what DHCP is and how it works, what non-routable addresses are, what NAP is, and what ARP is, and DNS, a whole alphabet soup of acronyms. And then how all these things are put together in your home environment. And we are going to spend a little bit of time on that. Okay, so on page 235, they start talking about the Dynamic Host Control Protocol, DHCP. And if the takeaway behind, if somebody says, well, what the heck is it for? Well, the answer to that is, it provides information to a newly booted machine. So a machine boots up and, he's been asleep and he doesn't remember anything. So this DHCP tells him, hey, I recognize you and here's an IP address that you can use and here's some other things. So it feeds information to the machine when it first wakes up. So what are the kind of things that every machine needs? Well, if you were to pop out to a command prompt and type something like ipconfig. Here's some of the things that your machine needs to know. It needs to know what its IP address is, okay? It needs to know where the default subnet is. And it needs to know what the subnet mask is. So a bare bones, it needs this piece of information right here, the IP4 address, the subnet mask, and the default gateway. Those are the bare bones basic three things that your machine doesn't have typically when it first gets turned on, but it gets provided to it by a DHCP server. Okay, and you might think, well, I don't have a DHCP server at home. Yeah, you do. You just don't know it. Okay. So what's wrong with just doing this all by hand? Why do we even have to have a DHCP server? Why don't we just go to every single machine and configure it to say, look, I'll just assign these numbers by hand. Okay? Yes, it can be done. I did it when I was managing about 400 computers. We didn't originally use DHCP. We statically assigned all the IP addresses, all the DNS servers, all the subnet masks, all that stuff by hand. We managed it in an Excel spreadsheet. And it was okay. I could do 400. We weren't that many machines that were coming and going, being replaced or something. So it wasn't terrible. But if somebody said, okay, now you have to do this for 4,000, I'd go, no, I need something better. So DHCP is actually optional, but practically no one does it that way. Okay. So here's what this thing looks like if you were to bring it up. And say, I don't want. So here are your choices. Your choices are obtain an IP address and obtain your DNS server from this DHCP thing. Or you could click this thing right here and you could provide those three pieces of information I just said. The IP address, the subnet mask, and the default router. And I could say, well, I'm going to give it my DNS servers as well. So I'd say, no thank you, I'll hand do those. And so you just type those guys in. Again, that's not typically the way it works, but it is an option. So let's explain another reason why this is an excellent idea. Let's say, for example, that you had a mobile device, and you went from like your home environment where you had a wireless setup, and then you went to work and you wanted to use their wireless, and then you came back home. If these things had been statically assigned every single time you moved from home to work, you'd have to go on there and change the settings. And then when you came back home, you had to go change the settings again. Clearly, that is not the way it should work. It should work that my mobile device goes to the new area, gets served by a different DHCP server, which provides it different numbers that are relevant to that environment. And then when I move to another environment, like my home environment, I get served a completely different set of numbers, which is relevant to my home environment. So again, DHCP is not really all that optional. And there's another thing that DHCP can do for you that you may not have thought about. And how's this? Let's say, for example, that you have 200 machines, but you've got them configured so that only half of them are actually used at any one time, like a classroom environment where you have multiple classrooms, but you know darn well there's not going to be people in both classrooms simultaneously. Okay, this is kind of a contrived example, but just bear with me. Some sort of a scenario where you have 100 machines, 200 machines, and only half of them are used at any one time. Okay, under that scenario, I could, for example, have only 100 IP addresses that I could serve to my 200 machines, because only half of them are going to be used at any one time. So DHCP could be used to serve a pool of 100 addresses to my machines, and so this one would drop off, and then this one would come on, and this one drop off, that one come on, and so I could conserve the amount of address spaces that I have. Now, I'll admit that's a little contrived, but it does kind of make sense. If I know darn well that not all of my machines are going to be turned on and running at the same time, then I don't really need that many IP addresses. I only need the number of IP addresses that are actually on it, the maximum number that are on at any one time. Okay, so they talk about a pool of addresses. I mentioned that phrase. So here's what a typical setting looks like in a DHCP server. Now, in this example, most likely you have a DHCP server because most likely you've got some sort of a Wi-Fi router at your house. And the Wi-Fi router does this for a living. You probably didn't have to go in and touch any of the settings whatsoever. Just out of the box, it did all this for you. But if you wanted to, you could go in there and look, and it would tell you, for example, what's the address range I'm going to send? Well, I'm going to send the address range of 192.168.1. Starting with 1, then going up to 150. So basically 150 PCs can be served by this DHCP server, which is most likely your router. Here's the subnet mask I'm going to send. Win server, that's some ancient stuff. And then the lease on how long this address is supposed to last. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on that in just a minute. Okay, so DHCP servers are set up with a pool of addresses that they issue out. What happens when you run out? Well, you'll get a little note basically saying, I'm sorry, we're out of IP addresses. You don't get one. Okay, that's how that works. Okay, on page 238, they finally start talking about the mechanics of it, the operation of a DHCP server and client. And this is a little confusing. And let's just start. So it starts with a broadcast. So the machine wakes up, it's kind of groggy, and it's wiping its eyes. It hadn't had its coffee yet. And so it basically says, who am I? And so he broadcast out to the world, hey, is anybody out there know what my IP address is? Well, there could be multiple DHCP servers. Now, in a home environment, that's not the case. You only have one. So let's just ignore this left-hand side. So the client basically says, hey, so I send out what's called a DHCP discover. The machine looks at it and goes, yeah. So he provides an offer saying, I'll be your server if that's okay. And here's some interesting things. And so it collects the replies, picks the one it wants, and then says, okay, I accept your offer. Now give me some numbers. And so it commits this configuration to memory because remember now, it can't issue the same IP address over again. So it has to kind of remember you. So it has to, I offered you a number, you accepted it, and therefore I'm not going to offer that to anybody else. And so I send it back, it goes through, and then we're good. Now, in theory, if your machine goes through a graceful shutdown, not one of those when you hit the power button, but one when you hit the start button and you say shut down or something like that, one of the last things it does, it sends a little thing saying release back to the server. So it says, okay, I'm done with this IP address. You're free to reuse it someplace else. Okay. So this lease operation comes up again. How long is this lease? Well, it's configurable. It's designed so that I provide you an IP address for some period of time, And it tries to be kind of nice. For example, let's say, for example, the time is expired, and I go back and I say, look, or actually almost ready to expire. Your machine says, hey, you know, my lease is about up. Could you renew my lease? And it's pretty smart. It says, well, look, I recognize you, and you're the exact same machine who asked for it originally, so that I'm going to give you the exact same MAC address, the exact same IP address over a second time. And they're actually pretty good at this. This works fairly well. Very rarely do you get an IP address, and then when the lease expires, you get another IP address. I mean, typically they give you one, and it'll remember you for quite some time, and try its best to give you the same one over and over again. It's not guaranteed, but it certainly tries its best. So, on page 240, they talk about the 3 techniques for doing that. The first one is called the automatic mode. And basically that means first come, first serve. Whoever asks for a number gets a number. And this is what's called a permanent lease, which means I basically don't use the timeout. I set the timeout to 0, meaning that I'm going to give you a number and it's yours forever. Okay? Well, until you reboot everything, but you know what I mean. It's not going to expire. Now, there are situations where you really do want to have the exact same IP address every single time. So you have to have some way of telling the machine to either reserve this or somehow issue them in the right order. Now, what scenario could you think of where I'd need a machine to always have the exact same IP address every single time? Will most likely be those things like servers that are going to be connected from the outside. Like, let's say I had a web server here at my house. I'd want to give it the exact same IP address every single time. Otherwise, it'd be just too confusing for people trying to hit my web server and go, oh, well, you know, gee, it's not around anymore. It's someplace else. And they would have to go through another lookup, and I'd have to be updating all these things. It just makes a heck of a lot of sense to just assign in an IP address and leave it the heck alone. Okay. So that's kind of sort of what this automatic mode is. By the way, a lot of people don't use the automatic mode just because there's no rhyme or reason to it. And we'll get into a way you can tweak that in just a minute. The next one is called manual. And basically what I do is I go in to my machine, my DHCP server, and I say, every time you see this MAC address, assign it this number. That's what I do at home. I have a list of MAC addresses for all of my hardwired devices, and a list of MAC addresses for all my wireless devices, and I very specifically say, okay, my development machine gets number 2, my tablet gets number 3, my laptop gets number 4, my printer gets number 5, my storage box gets number 6, just write on down the list. So this case is kind of sort of like automatic, except in automatic it just kind of, whichever one you got is the one you're going to keep. This is very similar, except I'm telling it this machine must be IP address 192.168.1.2. Cool. All right. So it's also a permanent kind of a scenario, very similar to what before is once it gets this, it's never going to expire. And even if it did expire, it would be given the same one because I've told it to look up the MAC address. Okay, so can I really kind of mix and match between the two modes here? Can I do an automatic and a manual simultaneously? Yeah, I could have these over here statically assigned via the MAC address, and then have automatic for everything else. That's actually a pretty reasonable way to do it. It's not the only way to do it. Doggone it, we're at the 15-minute mark. We'll pick this thing up again in just a few.